What if I told you that the story of David and Goliath, is incomplete? What they taught you in Sunday school was only the beginning. What comes next is a biblical truth hidden by generations, a spiritual war that goes far beyond a stone and a deep. After David knocked the giant, his life was in danger as never before. Because Goliath was not alone. He had brothers, Colossi thirsty for revenge, descendant warriors of a damn race that was born from the union between fallen angels and human women, as Genesis says 6. This part of the Bible is not preached in the pulpits, but today, you will discover it. You may feel that you have been fighting giants in your life, problems that are repeated, cycles of defeat, battles that seem to end. What if I told you that these struggles have a deeper spiritual root than you imagine? Today you will understand why some enemies seem not to surrender, and how God, through His Word, already gave you the strategy to overcome them. Jesus Christ not only came to save your soul, but to give you authority over all force of evil. And if you remain until the end of this video, you will discover how to activate that spiritual authority. This is not just an ancient story. It is a revelation that can transform your life. The Bible is full of prophetic codes, and one of them is hidden in the revenge of Goliath's brothers. What you are going to see today can break spiritual chains that have been operating in your life without you knew. So, if you believe in God, if you respect the Bible, and if you are ready for a real transformation, stay with me until the end, because there are truths that are only revealed to those who have enough faith to look for them. This is one of them. Before continuing, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate notifications, and comment below. Did you ever feel you were fighting something much bigger than you? We are going to read your testimonies and pray with you, because today, something is going to break in the spiritual. Get ready. Few know it, but Goliath's defeat at the hands of David was only a chapter within a much broader and dark history of what is usually told in the pulpits or in the Sunday schools. David, armed only with a sling and unwavering faith in God, knocked down the giant above the entire army of Israel, demonstrating that it was not the human force that brought victory, but the absolute trust in Jesus Christ and in the promises revealed in the Bible. However, here is the detail that almost nobody mentions. Goliath was not an isolated case. It belonged to a caste of giants known as the Rephaitas, direct descendants of the Nephilim dreaded. These beings were not only colossal in stature, but also in spiritual corruption, living symbols of a direct opposition to the will of God. So when David beat Goliath, it was not the end of a threat. It was the beginning of an ancestral war, a war between the light of God and the oldest darkness. The faith that moved David was not a passing emotion or a naive hope. It was a deep certainty rooted in his intimacy with God. While many saw a young pastor without experience, he knew himself supported by divine power. That is why he was able to face the Colossus without fear. But the threat that Goliath represented was just the tip of the iceberg. These giants were not just physical enemies, they were entities linked to a fallen spiritual past. According to Genesis 6, the Nephilim emerged from the union between the children of God, a reference to fallen angels and human women. The result, a hybrid generation, powerful in force, but totally opposite to the redemption plan drawn by God. Therefore, the Bible presents them not only as warriors, but as spiritual obstacles that should be demolished through faith and obedience to the true God. Many believers today see their problems as modern giants, but do not understand that these challenges have spiritual roots, such as the Rephaitas. Goliath's story reminds us that we do not fight against flesh or blood, as Ephesians 6:12 says, but against powers and principalities of evil. And as David did not depend on swords or armor, we must also depend on our faith in Jesus Christ to tear down the obstacles we face. The power of God is perfected in our weakness, and just as a young pastor defeated a giant with a stone and a prayer, we can also defeat when our soul undergoes the guide of the Word. The Bible does not leave us alone in battle. It equips us with promises, strengthens us with the Holy Spirit, and directs us towards the victory that has already been conquered by Christ. Goliath, however great, was nothing more than one among several. The biblical text reveals that he had brothers and relatives, also giants. They were a species marked by the constant challenge to God's sovereignty. However, none of them prevailed. And this shows us something deep. It doesn't matter how many enemies are lifted. If we walk in faith and under the coverage of the God of Israel, none can be sustained. Just as David had a divine purpose, you also have it. And every giant who gets up against you is an opportunity for God to demonstrate His glory through you. Each battle is an invitation to get closer to Jesus, to depend more on His presence, to trust His promises more. But this story does not end with an isolated victory. On the contrary, what follows is even deeper. Because after Goliath fell, his brothers did not stay with crossed hands. The enemy does not give up easily when he sees someone gets up with faith. Therefore, the next chapter of this sacred story leads us to know another giant, a feared being, called Isbi-Benob, who sought revenge and endangered David's life. What happened later reveals not only the power of the enemy, but also the importance of being surrounded by people of faith, men and women, who hold the sword when our forces fail. We will discover what happened in this almost forgotten part of the Bible. When talking about giants in the Bible, it is often thought that they are only symbolic figures or literary exaggerations. But the truth is that its origin is clearly described in the scriptures and reveals a spiritual reality that few dare to explore. In Genesis 6:1-4, we found a passage that has caused debates for centuries. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took women for themselves, choosing among all. The result of that union were the Nephilim, a race of giants, beings of great stature and supernatural power. But the most disturbing was not its size, but its spiritual nature. They were not simply human. They were the fruit of a corruption between the celestial and the earthly, a prohibited mixture that directly challenged the holiness of God's plan. Since then, these beings represented a continuous threat to the people of God, appearing in key moments of biblical history as obstacles that could only be defeated through true faith. Imagine for a moment the impact of living in a land where these creatures walked among men. They were seen by some as minor, demigod gods, even worshipped by pagan peoples who did not know the truth of the only God. And it wasn't just because of his physical strength. The ancient stories describe them as holders of hidden knowledge, advanced technology for their time, and mysterious skills. This fits what the Bible reveals to us about the fallen angels, beings that were created with power and wisdom, but decided to rebel against God. When mixed with humanity, they contaminated not only blood, but also the culture and spirituality of entire generations. In the midst of all that, God always raised his servants, as Noah, Abraham, Moses, and David, to face not only physical giants, but to ideologies, idolatries, and structures that these beings implanted on earth. The impact of the giants is not limited to the Old Testament. Its spiritual legacy continues until today, disguised as ideologies contrary to faith, sin structures, power systems that oppress and destroy people's hope. Therefore, understanding its origin is key to discerning how darkness operates in our day. Jesus Christ taught us to be wise as snakes and meek as pigeons, Matthew 10:16, and that implies recognizing the spiritual roots of the challenges we face. The Bible is not a book of ancient stories. It is a living guide that shows us how to face forces that, although invisible, are as real as the giants were in David's time. We do not fight against flesh or blood, but against spiritual hosts of evil, and we need the complete God's armor to resist, Ephesians 6:11-13. Today, many people face modern giants in the form of depression, addictions, traumas, disbelief, or the absence of purpose. But like the ancient Rephates, these battles also have a spiritual origin. Therefore, when someone tries to beat their struggles only with human strength, he wears out, frustrates, and sometimes even loses faith. But when he turns to God, he immerses himself in the Word and decides to walk from the hand of Jesus Christ. Everything begins to transform. Prayer becomes a powerful stone, fasting into a sharp sword, and praise in an impregnable fortress. If you are facing something that seems bigger than you, remember this: giants can be strong, but your faith in God is supernatural. And what comes from the sky will always have the victory over what rose from the rebellion. The history of the Nephilim is not just a biblical mystery, It is a spiritual warning. It shows us what happens when God's will is ignored and doors open to what He has already condemned. But it also reveals something glorious, that it does not matter how great the enemies are, God always preserves a faithful remnant, a generation that rises with faith and breaks ancient curses. And what comes next in this sacred story is an example of that. Because after the fall of Goliath, one of his brothers did not resign. His name was Isbi-Benob, a giant thirsty for revenge. And what happened when he faced David teaches us one of the most powerful lessons about spiritual fatigue and the need to be surrounded by people who also walk with God. Accompany me to discover what happened. David's story did not end with the fall of Goliath, as many think. Years later, when David was already king, with his body aged by the wars and responsibilities of leadership, he faced one of the most dangerous moments of his life. It was not an army or an enemy king who endangered him, but a giant with a little known but loaded with dark purpose, Isbi-Benob. This warrior, according to 2 Samuel 21:15-17, was a direct descendant of the Rephaitas and was determined to avenge the death of his brother Goliath. He wore a 3 kilos bronze spear and a new sword, as if he had been forged especially to kill the anointed one of God. At that time, David was not the young pastor full of energy, but a tired, vulnerable man, but still full of faith. And this is where this story reveals a deep truth. Even the strongest need help. David, the same one who had shot Goliath with a stone in God's guidance, was now weak, almost defeated. Isbi-Benob had cornered him, and it seemed that everything would end there. But in the midst of chaos, a faithful man appeared, full of value and the same faith that David had transmitted over the years. Abishai, his nephew. Without hesitation, Abishai faced the giant and killed him, saving the king's life. This act was not only a moment of courage, but a powerful representation of how faith can be multiplied and transferred. David had sown in his people a deep confidence in God, and at the time he no longer had the strength to raise his sword. It was that seed that held it. Jesus Christ taught us that the greatest love is to give life for friends, John 15:13, and Abishai lived it with facts, not with words. After this battle, David's soldiers gathered and made a solemn promise. "You will never go out with us to battle so that the Israel lamp does not go out." 2 Samuel 21:17. This phrase contains a deep spiritual revelation. David was not just a military leader. He was the spiritual light of a nation. His connection with God, his passion for prayer, his heart surrendered to the divine will, all that made him more valuable than any sword or strategy. In our life, there are also times when we need to recognize that being strong does not mean doing everything alone. Sometimes the greatest sample of faith is to allow others to sustain us, to pray for us, to raise us when we fall. God did not call us walk alone. The community of faith, the church, the spiritual family, are part of the divine design so that we can resist the attacks of the enemy together. The story of Isbi-Benob teaches us that the enemy does not forget. When you demolish a giant, when you make a decision of faith, when you break a spiritual chain, there will be a reaction. Tinieblas do not stay with crossed hands. But here is the key. If you remain in the Word, if you do not disconnect from the presence of God, if you keep your faith in Jesus Christ, no matter how many come, you will not be alone. David almost died, yes, but he was not defeated. And most powerful is that his legacy had already been transmitted. His courage, his praise, his intimacy with God had influenced the new generation. Therefore, do not underestimate what you sow today. Every prayer you do, every verse you share, every act of love you perform in the name of God is forming spiritual giants that will rise when you cannot anymore. And if you think the story ends here, you are very wrong, because Isbi-Benob was not the last. Goliath had other brothers, other giants thirsty for war. But one by one they were falling, not by the force of a single man, but by the collective faith of a people who had been trained in the truth of the Bible and guided by the presence of the Most High. In the next chapter, we are going to meet those other colossal warriors, some with supernatural deformations, all descendants of the Rephaitas, all defeated by men of faith. What you will discover below will not only expand your spiritual vision, but will show you that no giant is too great for the God who walks with you. After the fall of Goliath and the defeat of Isbi-Benob, one might think that the threat was over. But the Bible reveals something surprising. Goliath was not an only child. He had other brothers, gigantic warriors, all descendants of the Rephaitas, all marked by the same dark purpose: oppose the people of God. In 2 Samuel 21:18-22 and 1 Chronicles 20:4-8, we discovered that there were more clashes between the brave Israel and these giants. One of them was murdered by Elhanan, son of Jare-Oregim de Belen. Some ancient texts even say that this giant was also called Goliath, which has generated debates between scholars, but the main point is this: the name did not matter. They all belonged to the same corrupt spiritual root, and all were defeated by men who walked in faith, not by their physical strength, but by their living connection with God. Each giant represented a specific challenge, a different spiritual obstacle. One of them had 6 fingers in each hand and on each foot, a deformation that not only made it physically imposing, but also a symbol of something unnatural, a distortion of God's original design. This was killed by Jonathan, David's nephew, who rose with the same warrior spirit and the same faith that characterized his uncle. And this is where we see again the power of spiritual inheritance. David had formed not only warriors, but disciples, men who learned to depend on the Lord in everything. This victory was not a product of chance, but the fruit of a life dedicated to the Word, to prayer, to praise. And that speaks to us today. What we sow spiritually in our family and in our community can lift giants of faith that demolish the most feared obstacles. The Bible shows us that these giants, although they came with physical strength and heavy armament, did not resist before the authority of God manifested in their servants. This is a spiritual key to our daily life. There are situations that seem invincible, diseases that are repeated in the family, patterns of poverty, depression, vices, broken relationships. They are like those brothers of Goliath, silent but persistent enemies. But when we decide to walk firmly with Jesus, Christ, fill ourselves with His Word and surround ourselves with people who also seek God, then the impossible begins to happen. Each prayer becomes a spiritual attack, each act of faith in a spear that demolishes strengths. And just as Elhanan and Jonathan defeated the giants, we can also break the cycles that have tormented generations. Another powerful truth that we learn from these stories is that God does not work with lonely heroes. He raises teams, communities of faith, spiritual families. David did not beat alone. His legacy was multiplied. Each giant who fell after Goliath was shot down by someone who had learned with him, who had seen him worshiping, fighting, crying, and trusting. That invites us to think, what are we teaching with our life? Is our faith inspiring others to get up? Or are we living an isolated spirituality without influence in our generation? The Bible says in Proverbs 22:6, He instructs the child on his way, and even when he is old, he will not depart from him. The faith we share today becomes a sword tomorrow, and the most shocking thing is that all these giants, each of them, were defeated by common men, like you and me, but full of the Spirit of God. This teaches us that victory does not depend on titles or positions, but on active and obedient faith. Now, what we are going to see next goes beyond the physical history of the giants. We will enter a deeper, spiritual level, where battles against these enemies reveal a cosmic conflict between good and evil, between the light of heaven and the oldest darkness. In the next chapter, we will discover the true spiritual and prophetic meaning of these wars, and how these old biblical stories continue to speak to our lives today. Prepare, because what is coming is pure revelation. The battles between David and the giants were not simple physical clashes. Behind each stone thrown, each raised sword and every war cry, a much deeper battle was fought. A spiritual war between the people of God and the forces of the ancestral darkness. The Rephaitas were not only men of great stature, but living symbols of a corrupted spiritual inheritance, enemy of God's will. Every time one of these giants fell, it was not only a human victory, but a prophetic proclamation. Faith in the true God has power to demolish evil structures rooted from generations. That is why the Bible teaches us that not with army or strongly, but with my spirit, Jehovah said. Zechariah 4:6. And this truth is still in force today. The most decisive battles are not earned with muscle or money, but with faith, prayer, and obedience. When David faced Goliath, he did it with a faith that challenged logic. He was a young man without armor, without military experience, but with something that the giant could never understand: an alliance with God. That scene was much more than an act of courage. It was a prophetic demonstration of how authentic faith can subvert power systems. Every time someone decides to trust God over their circumstances, that same spiritual power is activated. Jesus Christ came into the world to break invisible chains, to show us that the real fight is against the sin structures that want to control our mind, our family, and our history. Therefore, victories against the giants have an eternal meaning. Each one who falls represents a strength of evil, demolished by the light of God. The history of the Rephaitas also reveals that there are battles that do not start with us, but that we must finish. Many of the giants we face today, addresses, traumas, fear, disbelief, did not start in our generation. They come from our ancestors, just as the Rephaitas came from the days before the flood. But just as God raised David, he can also lift you to be the last link in that chain. The Bible says in Isaiah 54:17, "No weapon forged against you will prosper," and this promise is real when you are in the purpose of God. Your life has a spiritual weight, a divine assignment. Each giant you face with faith is a step towards restoration not only of your history, but of your whole family. Each battle won is a prophecy fulfilled. This spiritual war also reveals an eternal principle. God always opposes the pride and exalts the humble. The giants represented pride, arrogance, human strength. David represented dependence, humility, faith. That's why he won. And this pattern is repeated throughout the Bible. Moses beat Pharaoh without a sword. Joshua collapsed walls with praise. Esther saved his people with fasting and prayer. And Jesus Christ defeated sin and death hung on a cross. God acts in ways that the world does not expect. Therefore, when you pray, when you read the Bible, when you decide to forgive, when you choose to love your enemy, you are fighting spiritual battles much more powerful than any physical war. You are participating in the redemption plan that God designed from the beginning. And so we reach a greater revelation. Wars against giants are not only stories of the past, but living representations of what happens in the spiritual world today. You were not called to flee from the giants, but to face them with the faith of a David, with the authority of a Son of God. Because when you walk with Jesus Christ, victory is already ensured. In the next and last chapter, we will understand what legacy David left with his victories and how those stories continue to impact our lives, teaching us that what began as a struggle with a stone ended as an eternal testimony of what God can do with someone who really believes him. Don't stop now. The best is yet to come. When we looked at David's life, especially in his last years, we understand that his greatest victory was not to kill giants, but to raise a generation that knew how to do it. His legacy is not summarized in battles won, but in the faith he transmitted, in the passion for God that he sowed in the hearts of his men. Despite being aged, exhausted by the wars and responsibilities of the reign, David never lost his connection with God. And that is what really supported the kingdom. He was a living example that even when physical forces fail, faith remains a flame that does not go out. The Bible teaches us in Acts 13:22 that David was a man according to the heart of God, and that heart was his true weapon. Because the giants not only beat swords, but with hearts surrendered to the Creator. Each of the brave who defeated Goliath's brothers had a piece of the spirit of David. It was not impulsive courage, but a faith trained in worship, obedience, and absolute trust in God's promises. That faith is formed when we face our own lions and bears, like David before Goliath. They are those hidden struggles, those solitary prayers, those tears shed in the presence of God that prepare us for the great public battles. Jesus Christ also formed disciples with that same vision. He did not look for crowds, but committed hearts, willing to follow him even to the cross. Therefore, David's legacy was not a political kingdom, but a spiritual inheritance that transcends time. And today you can be part of that same lineage of faith. giants represent much more than visible enemies. They are symbols of persistent challenges, ancient patterns, spiritual structures that seek to impose themselves on our lives and our families. But David's legacy teaches us that every giant can fall if we face life with faith in God, guided by the Bible and strengthened by communion with Jesus Christ. That is the most powerful inheritance we can leave. Unwavering faith, a life that inspires others to fight their own battles with spiritual courage. It is not about being perfect, but about being available to God, to recognize that our forces are limited, but their power is infinite. As 2 Corinthians 12:9 says, "My power is perfected in weakness." That is the promise for anyone who really surrenders to the divine plan. It is also important to understand that the legacy is not transmitted only with words, but with example. David not only spoke of God, he lived for God. His Psalms are still a lighthouse for those who seek comfort, direction, and hope. He was king, warrior, poet, and worshiper. And in each of those facets, it reflected a total dependence on the Most High. His life was a constant invitation to trust more, to fear less, to worship even in the valley of shadow of death. That is the type of inheritance that transforms generations. And you, what are you leaving behind? Is your life a model of faith or just an empty religious routine? God calls you today to live a living, real spirituality, to leave a footprint in your home, your church, your friends. And so we conclude this part of the trip, but not the story. Because what began with a stone in a valley ended up being a legacy that crossed generations. And if you decide to walk with God as David did, you can also see giants fall, lives to be transformed, and a new generation rise with fire and passion for Jesus Christ. Now that you know this story forgotten by many, you are ready to live a new level of faith. But first, let me show you how to start. Because what is coming now is a revelation that can open your spiritual eyes in a way that you never imagined. And now that you know this powerful and forgotten story, tell me, what was the most difficult giant you have faced in your spiritual life? We want to know your experience. Share below in the comments, because your testimony can strengthen someone else's faith. Do not go without interacting. This space is a community of faith and your voice matters. If this video spoke to the heart, subscribe now and activates the bell, so you will not miss the next contents that will transform your life with deep, biblical revelations and full of power. And do not forget to see the following video that is appearing here on the screen. I will reveal another hidden mystery in the Bible that can open your spiritual eyes as never before. Click and continue this day of faith with us. See you in the next video. I am Ephraim, and may God bless you greatly.